Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes today. Um, we're taking a deep dive into Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies. And this book challenges a lot of common economic assumptions across all kinds of different areas. And I think you'll find his insights particularly thought-provoking.
It is a fascinating look at how easily we can be swayed by narratives that sound good on the surface, even when they contradict the evidence. Sowell really encourages us to think critically and question what we think we know about economics.
Okay, so before we get into specifics, can you give us a quick overview of the book's main themes? What's the big takeaway here?
So Sowell's central argument is that many widely held beliefs about economics are actually fallacies that can lead to misguided policies and unintended consequences. He explores these fallacies across all sorts of different domains, from urban life and gender dynamics to academia, racial disparities, and third world development.
So that sounds incredibly relevant, especially in today's world. He doesn't shy away from controversial topics.
Does he? Not at all. But he always brings a wealth of evidence and historical context to the discussion, encouraging us to look beyond simplistic explanations and consider the interplay of various factors.
So it's like he's giving us a toolkit for critical thinking about economic issues. So how does he structure his analysis? Does he lay out a specific framework for identifying and debunking these fallacies?
He does. Sowell identifies four major fallacies that he dissects throughout the book. The first is the zero-sum fallacy, which is the belief that one person's gain must come at another person's expense.
Oh, I heard that one before. Like the argument that immigrants
Yeah.
are stealing jobs from native-born workers.
Exactly. Sowell demonstrates that. This is a flawed assumption, particularly in a free market, with economic interactions can actually create new wealth and opportunities. He uses the example of rent control to illustrate how this fallacy can backfire.
Rent control. But isn't that supposed to help low-income renters?
Yeah.
By keeping housing affordable?
That's the intention. But Sowell shows that the long-term consequences are often the opposite. When you artificially suppress prices, landlords have less incentive to maintain their properties or build new ones. This leads to housing shortages, decreased quality, and ultimately hurts the very people rent control was meant to protect.
That's a really powerful example of how good intentions can lead to unintended consequences. Makes you wonder how often this happens in other policy areas.
That's exactly what Sowell encourages us to consider. He then dives into the fallacy of composition, which is the mistake of assuming that what's true for a part is also true for the whole.
I'm guessing there are plenty of examples of that.
There are. He uses the common misconception that building more roads will simply lead to more traffic to illustrate this fallacy.
So he's saying that sometimes expanding capacity can actually reduce congestion.
Yes. And he uses the example of Houston, Texas, where extensive road expansion actually led to reduced congestion.
Huh. That's counterintuitive. You'd think more roads just attract more cars and make traffic worse.
It seems that way, but Sowell's point is that we need to look at the bigger picture and consider the dynamics of supply and demand.
Okay, what's the next fallacy?
It's what he calls the chess pieces fallacy, the idea that social planners can manipulate people like pieces on a chessboard without regard for their individual choices and motivations.
So it's about overlooking human agency.
Precisely. Sowell argues that people aren't passive objects. They respond to incentives, make choices based on their own values, and often behave in ways that social engineers fail to anticipate.
Yeah, I can see how that would throw a wrench into a lot of well-intentioned plans.
Exactly. And he provides several examples of social experiments aimed at reducing crime or poverty that backfired because they failed to account for human behavior.
Okay, so we've got the zero-sum fallacy, the fallacy of composition, and the chess pieces fallacy. What's the fourth one?
The open-ended fallacy, which is advocating for desirable things, like health or safety, without acknowledging the inherent limitations of resources.
It sounds like a lot of political rhetoric falls into that trap. It's easy to say, we need more spending on education or healthcare without acknowledging where the money will come from,
Right.
or what trade-offs will be necessary.
That's exactly what Sowell is getting at. He emphasizes that resources are finite and that every dollar spent on one thing is a dollar that can't be spent on something else. While these goals are laudable, they become problematic when pursued without considering the costs.
So he's calling for a more realistic
Yeah.
and pragmatic approach to policymaking.
Exactly. He wants us to consider the costs, the trade-offs, and the unintended consequences before we jump on board with any policy, no matter how well-intentioned it may seem.
This is already giving me a whole new perspective on how to think about economic issues. So now that we have a grasp of The 4 major fallacies Sowell dissects. How does he apply them to specific areas, like urban life or gender dynamics?
He dives deep into several domains, starting with urban facts and fallacies. He challenges a lot of conventional wisdom about cities, like the assumption that slums inevitably breed crime.
You mean the idea that if you just improve the physical environment of a neighborhood, you'll automatically reduce crime rates?
Yes. But Sowell argues that the causal arrow might actually point in the opposite direction. Crime and social pathologies can lead to the deterioration of neighborhoods, creating slums, rather than the other way around.
So it's not the environment that's causing the crime. It's the crime that's creating the environment.
Precisely. He uses a phrase throughout the book that really drives this point home, mistaking a symptom for a cause.
That's a great way to put it. So if improving the physical environment isn't the solution, what does Sowell suggest we do about crime in urban areas?
He argues that we need to address the root causes of crime, which he sees as primarily cultural and behavioral. He emphasizes the importance of strong families, a work ethic, and a respect for the law.
It sounds like he's advocating for a more holistic approach that goes beyond just law enforcement or social programs.
You're absolutely right. He's calling for a cultural shift that prioritizes personal responsibility, accountability, and a commitment to the common good.
That's a pretty tall order, but it's definitely something worth striving for. So after tackling urban issues, where does Sowell take us next?
He dives into male-female facts and fallacies, where he tackles gender disparities in income and career paths.
That's a topic that always generates a lot of debate, and I'm sure Sowell's analysis is no exception.
You're right. He challenges the assumption that these disparities are solely the result of employer discrimination. He examines other contributing factors, like choices regarding continuous versus discontinuous employment, the impact of family responsibilities, and the types of career paths men and women tend to choose.
So it sounds like he's urging us to consider a wider range of factors beyond just discrimination.
Exactly. He acknowledges that discrimination exists, but he argues that it's important to disentangle it from other factors that also play a significant role.
It makes sense. It's about looking at the whole picture, rather than just focusing on one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
So what are some of the other factors that Sowell highlights?
He emphasizes the impact of choices made. Regarding continuous versus discontinuous employment, historically, women have been more likely to take breaks from their careers for family responsibilities, particularly motherhood.
That makes sense. And even today, women often bear a disproportionate share of the burden when it comes to childcare and other family obligations.
Yes. And these career interruptions, even if temporary, can have a long-term impact on earnings and career trajectories.
It's not just about the lost income during the time away. It's also about the missed opportunities for promotions, skill development, and building professional networks.
Exactly. And even when women choose not to interrupt their careers, the prospect of future interruptions, real or perceived, can affect how employers view their potential for advancement.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The expectation that women are more likely to take career breaks can lead to them being passed over for promotions, which in turn reinforces the perception that they're less committed to their careers.
That's a great point. And it highlights the complex interplay between societal expectations, individual choices, and economic outcomes.
It's definitely not a simple issue with easy answers. So beyond career interruptions, what are some of the other factors that Sowell explores in this section?
He discusses the impact of career choices. Even today, women tend to gravitate towards certain professions more than others, and these choices can have a significant impact on earnings.
So even if there's no overt discrimination, the fact that women are overrepresented in certain lower-paying professions could contribute to the gender pay gap.
That's what Sowell is suggesting. And it's not about blaming women for their choices. It's about understanding the complex interplay of cultural expectations, personal preferences, and market forces that shape these decisions.
It's about looking at the systemic factors that contribute to these patterns, rather than just focusing on individual cases of discrimination.
Exactly. And this brings us to Sowell's analysis of a very famous legal case, the EEOC's lawsuit against Sears. He uses it to illustrate the dangers of relying solely on statistical disparities to prove discrimination.
So in this case, the government sued Sears based on the fact that there was a pay gap between male and female employees, but they couldn't actually prove that. Individual women had been discriminated against.
Right. Sowell's point is that statistical gaps, while suggestive, don't necessarily prove discrimination. There may be other factors at play, like the ones we've been discussing, that could account for those disparities. He argues that you need to look at the specific practices and policies of the company, not just the overall numbers.
That makes sense. It's about being rigorous and evidence-based, rather than just jumping to conclusions based on statistics. So where do we go from here? What's the next area that Sowell tackles?
He delves into the world of higher education. In Academic Facts and Fallacies, he explores how colleges and universities, especially those with large endowments or state funding, operate under very different incentives than businesses.
So it's not a level playing field when it comes to the economics of higher education.
Not quite. Businesses are constantly pressured to be efficient, innovative, and keep costs down to stay competitive. But colleges and universities, especially nonprofit institutions, have more leeway.
I can see how that could lead to some inefficiencies and a lack of accountability. What are some of the specific issues that Sowell highlights?
He discusses how job security systems, like tenure, while intended to protect academic freedom, can also lead to higher costs. It limits an institution's flexibility to adjust staffing levels based on changing needs or financial constraints.
So the very system that's supposed to promote intellectual freedom might also be contributing to rising tuition costs. That's an interesting paradox. What else does he critique about higher education?
He critiques the role of accrediting agencies, which he argues can stifle innovation and competition in higher education by setting rigid standards that favor traditional institutions over newer, more cost-effective models.
It sounds like he's concerned about a lack of competition and a resistance to change within the higher education system.
That's a good way to put it. He sees this as a problem because it can lead to higher costs, less innovation, and fewer choices for students.
He also delves into a topic that always gets people riled up: the high salaries of college coaches.
Yes, and this is where the misalignment of incentives becomes very apparent. From the university's perspective, pouring millions of dollars into a football team that consistently loses money might seem irrational, especially when tuition costs are skyrocketing.
It definitely seems like a misplaced priority.
But from the coach's perspective, winning games and attracting top talent can lead to personal prestige, lucrative endorsements, and even higher salaries.
So their incentives aren't necessarily aligned with the overall financial well-being of the institution.
Right, and because universities are often governed by boards of trustees who are more focused on prestige and alumni satisfaction, then on the bottom line, there's less pressure to control these expenditures.
It's almost like a microcosm of the broader issue of misaligned incentives that we see in many large, complex organizations. So after tackling the thorny issues of higher education, where does Sowell take us next?
He dives into a topic that's been dominating headlines for years: income inequality, in a chapter called Economic Facts and Fallacies.
That's a topic that everyone seems to have an opinion on. I'm curious to hear Sowell's take on it.
He challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom around income inequality, starting with the claim that incomes have remained stagnant for decades.
I've heard that argument before. It's often used to suggest that the average American isn't making any economic progress.
Exactly. But Sowell points out that these statistics often fail to account for changes in household size and composition. The average number of people per household has been declining. So even if household income hasn't increased dramatically, per capita income has risen significantly.
So even though it might look like average income has stayed flat, when you adjust for the fact that households are smaller, people are actually earning more per person than they used to.
Yeah, exactly. And this ties into Sowell's broader point about the importance of looking at the data carefully and not being misled by statistics that don't tell the whole story.
It's about being critical consumers of information.
Yeah.
And not just accepting whatever statistics we're presented with at face value. So beyond the issue of stagnant incomes, what are some of the other fallacies that Sowell tackles in this section?
He critiques the tendency to exaggerate income inequality by overlooking government transfers to lower-income households and taxes paid by higher-income earners.
So he's saying that the official income statistics don't always reflect the actual distribution of economic resources after the government has done its redistributing.
Exactly. He argues that failing to account for these transfers creates a distorted picture. The actual distribution of income. He also challenges the very notion that income is distributed as if from a central pot. He emphasizes that. Income is primarily earned through the production of goods and services.
So it's not some benevolent or malevolent entity deciding who gets what slice of the pie. It's about individuals being rewarded for their contributions to the economy.
Precisely. And this brings him to a critique of a very commonly used phrase, life's chances.
Life chances. What's wrong with that phrase? It seems pretty harmless.
Sowell argues that it implies that your economic outcomes
Mm-hmm.
are predetermined by the circumstances of your birth.
So it's about pushing back against deterministic narratives
Yeah.
that downplay the role of individual agency and choice.
Exactly. He doesn't deny that. Social factors play a role, but he insists that individuals still have the power to make choices that shape their destinies. He also points out that many discussions about income inequality conflate two separate issues, poverty and income inequality.
That's an important distinction. Just because some people are wealthy doesn't automatically mean others have to be poor.
Right. And Sowell argues that conflating these issues leads to misguided policies focused on redistributing wealth rather than creating opportunities for upward mobility.
It's about addressing the root causes of poverty, rather than just treating the symptoms through income transfers.
Exactly. He really challenges us to think differently about these complex issues and to be wary of solutions that sound good in theory, but may not work in practice.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. So after tackling the contentious issue of income inequality, where does Sowell take us next?
He dives into the sensitive but crucial topic of racial disparities in racial facts and fallacies.
I can imagine. This is where his data-driven approach and nuanced perspective are particularly important.
You're absolutely right. He urges us to look beyond simplistic explanations for racial disparities, particularly the legacy of slavery argument.
It's a common narrative that suggests that the economic disadvantages faced by many Black Americans today are solely the result of slavery and its aftermath.
Right. But Sowell challenges this simplistic view. He acknowledges the impact of historical injustices, but argues that we need to consider other factors, including cultural differences and patterns of behavior, to fully understand the persistence of racial disparities.
So he's not denying the legacy of slavery, but arguing that it's not the only explanation for current disparities.
Exactly. He uses historical and contemporary examples to illustrate his point, showing how factors like geography, cultural values, and family structure can play a significant role in shaping economic outcomes.
It sounds like he's advocating for a more holistic approach that takes into account the complex interplay of historical and economic forces.
You're absolutely right. He doesn't offer easy answers, but he challenges us to think more critically about the factors that contribute to racial disparities.
It's about moving beyond simplistic narratives and engaging in a more nuanced and evidence-based discussion. So after exploring racial disparities, what's the final area that Sowell tackles in the book?
He concludes with third world facts and fallacies, where he challenges conventional wisdom about economic development and global poverty.
I'm guessing he takes aim at some of the popular narratives.
Yeah.
About rich nations exploiting poor nations.
He does. He argues that while external forces can play a role, internal factors are often more significant in explaining why some countries remain underdeveloped.
So it's not just about blaming colonialism or globalization for the problems of the developing world.
Exactly. He emphasizes the importance of internal factors like geography, culture, institutions, and policy choices.
It's about acknowledging the agency and responsibility
Okay.
of developing countries themselves.
Precisely. He backs up his arguments with historical and statistical evidence showing how countries with similar colonial histories have experienced vastly different economic outcomes. He argues that we need to move beyond simplistic explanations and consider a wider range of factors.
It's about taking a more nuanced and holistic approach to understanding global poverty and development.
You've got it. And that same emphasis on nuance and evidence is evident throughout the entire book. It's what makes Economic Facts and Fallacies such a powerful and thought-provoking read.
This has been a great overview. I feel like I've already learned so much from just this initial exploration of Sowell's key ideas. But I'm eager to dive deeper into some of the specific examples and insights he offers in each chapter.
I'm happy to guide you through those. There's so much more to unpack. And I think you'll find Sowell's analysis both challenging and illuminating.
I'm ready to be challenged, so where should we start?
Let's begin by revisiting urban facts and fallacies and exploring some of the specific examples Sowell uses to debunk common misconceptions about the economics of cities.
Sounds good to me. Let's dive in.
You recall that we left off discussing urban facts and fallacies. Sowell challenges the common belief that building more roads inevitably leads to more traffic. It seems intuitive.
Yeah, it does. You'd think more roads would just attract more cars.
Yeah.
Making congestion worse.
Right. That's the fallacy of composition at work.
Yeah.
Sowell highlights Houston's experience, where extensive road expansion actually led to reduced congestion.
So expanding capacity can sometimes ease congestion, even if it seems counterintuitive. So what else does Sowell challenge about our understanding of cities?
Well, he tackles the myth that slums breed crime, arguing that the direction of causality might be the reverse. Crime and social pathologies can lead to the deterioration of neighborhoods, creating slums.
So it's not the physical environment causing the problems,
Yeah.
but the underlying social issues
Mm-hmm.
that are manifesting in that environment.
Right.
He's mistaking the symptom for the cause.
Exactly. And he also tackles the misconception that the high cost of living in cities is solely due to exploitation, like landlords gouging tenants.
Right, that's a common perception,
Ah.
especially in cities with large income disparities.
Sowell offers a more nuanced perspective. He argues that higher costs in low-income neighborhoods often reflect higher operating costs for businesses due to factors like crime, smaller-scale operations, and greater risks.
So it's not necessarily malicious intent, it's about businesses adjusting prices to reflect the economic realities
Yeah.
of operating in those environments.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating perspective. Okay, so let's shift gears to another area where Sowell challenges conventional wisdom.
Gender disparities.
Right, in male-female facts and fallacies.
Mm-hmm.
Sowell emphasizes the importance of disentangling employer discrimination from other factors that contribute to income and career path disparities
Yeah.
between men and women.
I imagine this is a topic that could easily lead to some pretty heated debates. How does he approach such a sensitive issue?
Well, with the same commitment to evidence and nuanced analysis that he brings to every topic. He acknowledges that discrimination exists, but argues that it's not the only factor at play. He encourages us to consider the impact of choices regarding continuous versus discontinuous employment, career paths, and full-time versus part-time work.
Right. So it's about looking beyond simplistic explanations and considering the complex interplay of individual choices, societal expectations, and market forces. Exactly. For example, women are historically more likely to take breaks from their careers for family responsibilities, like motherhood. These interruptions, even if temporary, can have a long-term impact on earnings and career trajectory.
Right. It's not just about lost wages during the time away. It's also about the missed opportunities for promotions, skill development,
Yeah.
and building professional networks.
Exactly. So Well meticulously breaks down these factors. Using a wealth of statistical data, he also examines the impact of career choices, noting that women often gravitate towards certain professions, like teaching or social work, which tend to have lower salaries than fields like engineering or finance.
Right. It's that old saying, a woman's work is never done, but it also often pays less. It's interesting to consider how these choices, even when driven by
Personal preferences or societal expectations can have such significant economic consequences. Sowell makes a very compelling case for understanding the whole picture. He also critiques lawsuits against companies based solely on statistical disparities in income without evidence of individual discrimination. He uses the famous Sears case, where the EEOC sued the company based on aggregate income differences between men and women, but failed to produce evidence of discriminatory practices.
That's a great example. It highlights the importance of looking beyond overall statistics and examining whether there is evidence of actual discriminatory practices. It's about being rigorous and evidence-based rather than just jumping to conclusions. Okay, let's move on to another fascinating area, the economics of higher education.
Right. In Economic Facts and Fallacies, Sowell explores how colleges and universities, particularly nonprofit institutions, are often insulated from the competitive pressures of a free market. They operate under very different incentives than businesses.
So they're not subject to the same pressures to be efficient and keep costs down.
Exactly. Businesses have to constantly worry about efficiency, innovation, and keeping costs low to stay competitive. But colleges and universities, especially those with large endowments or state funding, have more leeway.
Yeah, I can see how that could lead to some problems. What are some of the specific issues, Zoe points out?
Well, he argues that job security systems like tenure, while designed to protect academic freedom, can contribute to higher costs. Tenure grants professors lifetime employment, limiting the institution's flexibility to adjust staffing levels based on changing needs or financial constraints.
So the very system that's meant to encourage intellectual freedom might be contributing to rising tuition costs. It's an interesting paradox. What else does he critique about higher education?
Well, he critiques the role of accrediting agencies, arguing that they can stifle innovation and competition. They often set rigid standards that favor traditional institutions over newer, more cost-effective models.
Right, sounds like. He sees the accreditation process as a barrier to entry for new players who might challenge the status quo and potentially offer more affordable options for students.
You're right. He gives the example of law schools that have found ways to keep tuition low by using practicing attorneys and judges as part-time instructors. They often face difficulties getting accredited because their student-to-faculty ratios don't meet the standards set by accrediting bodies.
It seems counterintuitive. To penalize schools for being efficient, it reinforces the feeling that the higher education system is resistant to change and innovation.
Right. That's a key takeaway from this chapter. Sowell also highlights the often controversial issue of the high salaries of college coaches.
Right. That's something that's always baffled me. Why would a university pour millions of dollars into a football team that consistently loses money, especially when tuition costs are rising?
Right. It comes down to misaligned incentives. From the university's perspective, it might seem irrational, but from the athletic director or coach's perspective, it makes perfect sense. Winning games and attracting top talent can boost their own prestige and lead to lucrative endorsements and higher salaries.
So their personal incentives are not aligned with the overall financial well-being of the institution.
Exactly.
It's a fascinating example of how individual incentives can sometimes work against the common good.
Right. Now let's move on to another hot-button issue, income inequality.
Income facts and fallacies. So Sowell really digs into this topic. That's been at the forefront of public debate for years.
He challenges many widely held beliefs about income inequality, starting with the claim that incomes have remained stagnant for decades. He argues that this claim often fails to account for changes in household size and composition.
So even though household income might not have increased dramatically, per capita income has actually risen significantly because households are smaller?
Right. It's a classic example of how looking at the data in a different way can completely change your understanding of a problem. He also points out that many discussions about income inequality fail to account for government transfers to lower income households and taxes paid by higher income earners.
So the actual distribution of income might be more equitable than it appears if you take those transfers and taxes into account.
Exactly. Failing to consider those factors can create a distorted picture of the actual economic landscape. He also critiques the very notion that income is distributed, arguing that income is primarily earned through the production of goods and services.
Right. So it's not about some entity deciding who gets what. It's about individuals being rewarded for their contributions.
Exactly. He challenges us to move beyond simplistic notions of fairness and to think more critically about how wealth is created in a market economy. This leads him to a critique of the idea of life chances, which he sees as a deterministic concept that downplays individual agency.
Right. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that people's outcomes are predetermined by their circumstances. But Sowell reminds us that individuals have the power to make choices that shape their destinies.
Absolutely. And this emphasis on individual agency is a core theme. Throughout his work, he also makes an important distinction between poverty and income inequality, arguing that conflating the two leads to misguided policies.
Right. Just because there are wealthy people doesn't mean there have to be poor people. It's important to focus on creating opportunities for upward mobility, not just on redistributing wealth.
Exactly. And that brings us to another sensitive topic, racial disparities.
Right. In Racial Facts and Fallacies, Sowell navigates this complex issue with his trademark, data-driven approach. I'm curious to hear how he handles such a sensitive and often emotionally charged subject.
Well, he begins by acknowledging the impact of historical injustices, particularly slavery and segregation. But he also cautions against relying solely on those factors to explain current disparities.
So he's acknowledging the legacy of the past, but arguing that it's not the only explanation for the present.
Exactly. He emphasizes the importance of considering other factors, such as cultural differences and patterns of behavior, to fully understand the persistence of racial disparities.
Right. It sounds like he's calling for a more nuanced and holistic approach. That takes into account the complex interplay of
historical,
cultural,
and economic forces.
You got it. He doesn't offer easy answers or simplistic solutions. Instead, he challenges us to engage in a more honest and evidence-based conversation about the factors that contribute to racial disparities.
Right. It's about moving beyond blame and guilt and focusing on understanding the root causes of these disparities so that we can develop more effective solutions. That's a powerful message. Okay, so we've covered urban issues, gender disparities, higher education, income inequality, and racial disparities. What's the final frontier?
In Sowell's exploration of economic fallacies?
His last chapter, Third World Facts and Fallacies, challenges conventional wisdom about economic development and global poverty.
Right, and this is an area where I think a lot of people have strong opinions, but maybe not as much factual knowledge.
You're probably right. And that's why Sowell's analysis is so valuable. He encourages us to look beyond simplistic narratives and consider the complex interplay of internal and external factors.
So he's challenging the common narrative that wealthy nations got rich by exploiting poor nations.
Exactly. He argues that while colonialism and exploitation have undoubtedly played a role in some cases, they can't fully explain the persistence of poverty in many developing countries. He points out that many countries with similar colonial histories have experienced vastly different economic outcomes.
So internal factors like geography, culture, institutions, and policy choices also play a significant role.
Absolutely. He highlights the importance of secure property rights, the rule of law, a stable monetary system, and limited government intervention as essential ingredients for economic growth.
It sounds like he's advocating for a more market-oriented approach to development, one that emphasizes individual initiative and entrepreneurship, rather than top-down government control.
You're right. He's critical of the notion that foreign aid is a panacea for poverty, arguing that it can often create perverse incentives and foster dependency. He believes that the best way to help developing countries is to create an environment where they can help themselves.
It's about empowering individuals and communities to create their own prosperity, rather than relying on handouts.
Exactly. He reminds us that lasting progress comes from within, not from external interventions.
This has been such an enlightening discussion. Sowell really challenges us to think differently about so many important issues.
He
encourages us to be critical consumers of information, to question our assumptions, and to look beyond simplistic narratives.
Right. He's a master at dismantling conventional wisdom and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. But he does it all with a profound respect for individual liberty and a belief in the power of human ingenuity to overcome adversity and create a better world.
And that's what makes this book so compelling and so relevant today. It's not just about economics, it's about understanding the forces that shape our world and empowering individuals to take control of their own destinies.
Well said.
Are you ready to dive into the final chapter and explore some of Sowell's insights on the third world?
Absolutely. Let's unpack his critique of the exploitation narrative and explore some of his alternative explanations for why some countries thrive while others struggle.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
So we're diving into third world facts and fallacies, and Sowell really kind of dismantles that popular narrative that rich nations exploit poor nations.
Yeah, and I think that's a topic where a lot of people have strong feelings, often fueled by guilt or maybe outrage.
It's easy to get caught up in that idea that wealthy nations became prosperous by exploiting developing countries. But Sowell encourages us to kind of look beyond that, simplistic view.
So it's not as simple as saying, one side's gain is automatically the other side's loss.
Exactly. He argues that while colonialism and exploitation have undoubtedly played a role in some cases, they don't fully explain the persistence of poverty in, many parts of the world. He emphasizes the importance of understanding the internal factors that contribute to a country's economic development or lack thereof.
So it's not just about blaming the West for all the problems of the developing world.
Right. He highlights factors like geography, culture, institutions, and policy choices as critical determinants of a nation's economic trajectory. He backs up his arguments with a wealth of historical and statistical evidence showing how countries with similar colonial histories have experienced vastly different economic outcomes.
Right. That makes you wonder, how much of a role those internal factors play?
That's exactly the question he wants us to consider. He provides a fascinating analysis of the role of geography in economic development, pointing out that landlocked countries, for example, face inherent disadvantages in terms of trade and access to global markets.
Yeah, it makes sense when you think about it. Access to waterways has always been crucial for transportation and trade. Those countries with easy access to ports and navigable rivers have a natural advantage.
He also notes how easily culture and technology spread across the Eurasian landmass compared to the Americas, which were geographically isolated for centuries. Before European contact,
Right.
Geography can have a profound impact on a civilization's development.
It's incredible how something as simple as the shape of a continent
Right.
can influence the course of history and economic development.
What are some of the other internal factors that Sowell highlights? Well, he places a strong emphasis on the importance of secure property rights as a foundation for economic growth. He argues that when individuals have confidence that their assets are protected by the law, they're more likely to invest, accumulate wealth, and take risks, knowing that the fruits of their labor won't be arbitrarily confiscated.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you don't feel secure in your ownership of something, why would you invest time and resources in improving it? It creates an environment of uncertainty.
And discourages risk-taking.
Exactly. He also delves into the role of cultural values and practices, arguing that certain cultural traits can either hinder or facilitate economic advancement.
Right. And this is a sensitive area. I'm curious how he navigates this topic without resorting to stereotypes or generalizations.
Oh, he's very careful to avoid essentializing entire cultures. He focuses on specific values and practices that have been shown to correlate with economic outcomes. For example, he highlights the importance of a strong work ethic, a willingness to delay gratification, and a focus on education as factors that often contribute to economic success. All right, so it's not about saying that one culture is inherently superior to another. It's about recognizing that different cultural values can have a significant impact on how individuals and societies behave economically.
Precisely. And he provides numerous examples from around the world. To illustrate his point, he discusses how immigrant groups have often achieved remarkable economic success in their adopted countries by bringing with them a culture that emphasized hard work, thrift, and education.
Right, he often talks about groups like the Lebanese in West Africa, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, or the Jews in Europe and America as examples of groups who have thrived in diverse environments because of their cultural values and entrepreneurial spirit.
Exactly. Those examples underscore his point that culture can be a powerful engine of economic mobility.
Yeah.
He also challenges the common belief that foreign aid is a reliable solution to global poverty.
And I'm sure that's a controversial stance, especially among those who believe that. Wealthy nations have a moral obligation to help poorer countries.
It is. But Sowell argues that foreign aid often fails to produce the intended results. He points out that massive transfers of wealth often fail to generate sustainable economic growth and have sometimes even exacerbated problems in recipient countries.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the underlying dynamics and ensuring that aid is used effectively.
Precisely. He argues that foreign aid can create perverse incentives, fostering corruption and dependency, rather than self-reliance and sustainable growth.
Right, it reminds me of that saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly, and he advocates for a more market-oriented approach to development, one that focuses on removing barriers to trade, securing property rights, and promoting entrepreneurship. He emphasizes the importance of creating an environment where individuals and businesses can thrive, rather than relying on government handouts or top-down control.
Right, it's about empowering people to create their own prosperity, rather than trying to engineer it from above. That's a powerful message. And it's consistent with his emphasis on individual liberty and limited government throughout the book.
You're absolutely right. He challenges us to rethink our assumptions about development and to consider alternative approaches that might be more effective in the long run.
Well, this has been such an incredible journey. Through economic facts and fallacies, Sowell has given us so much to think about.
He has. His book is a treasure trove of insights, and I hope our listeners are inspired to explore his work further.
I agree. He challenges us to be more critical thinkers, to question conventional wisdom, and to ground our beliefs in evidence rather than ideology. He reminds us that the world is a complex place and that there are rarely easy answers to difficult problems.
He also reminds us that even though the world is complex, that doesn't mean we should despair. He has a deep faith in the power of human ingenuity to overcome challenges and create a better future.
Right. It's a message of hope and empowerment. He's not just pointing out problems. He's also offering solutions and encouraging us to be active participants in shaping a more just and prosperous world.
That's a great way to summarize Sowell's message. He wants us to be informed, engaged, and empowered to make a difference.
Well said. This has been a truly enlightening deep dive. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Thomas Sowell's brilliant and thought-provoking work.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to pick up Economic Facts and Fallacies and continue your own exploration of these important ideas. Until next time, stay curious.